This is the eLearn podcast, episode 84.
And the common glue throughout this, whatever country you go to, and I talk about the technology, but fundamentally the success or failure of teaching and learning is about that relationship and dynamic between the teacher and the students in the classroom.
Welcome to the eLearn podcast. My name's Laddick, and I'm your host from OpenLMS. My guest for today is Al Kingsley, who is an EdTech thought leader, a disruptor, an author, and the CEO of the company NetSupport, which has been providing technology solutions for education for more than 30 years. In this wide-ranging conversation, Al and I discuss what priorities schools should continue to look at as we come out of the pandemic and enter a new normal, including social and mental health issues, implementing what we know works in EdTech now, and understanding knowledge versus skills in what we're delivering for learners. We also talk about why priorities and challenges change not only globally, but also from city to city and neighborhood to neighborhood, and why tech is almost never the answer and not the main actor on the stage in learning. We also talk about the ephemeral nature of content, software, and hardware, and how Al recommends you create a strategy around this to turn a potential negative into a positive. Al also talks about how technology has not only allowed us to reach audiences that were usually not involved in the education process, think like unengaged parents, but also presents the challenge of ensuring that we keep learners safe through this process. We also talk about why you should push for innovation, but only when you have validation and buy-in for the solution that you're going to implement, and why signposting experts is a great strategy for adoption and success. We end our conversation talking about how the success and failure of teaching, when it's all said and done, is still massively dependent upon the relationship between the learner and the teacher, and why we need to focus now more than ever on supporting them. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning podcast is sponsored by the eLearn Success Series, a uniquely valuable set of events that bring together sector experts and thought leaders to offer solutions to the most critical challenges and issues at the intersection of education and technology. Get your free ticket to all 4 sessions at elearnsuccessseries.com. And OpenLMS, a company that provides world-class LMS solutions that empower organizations to meet education and workplace learning needs. Learn more by visiting openlms.net.
Welcome to Al Kingsley. He's the CEO of NetSupport. I've been watching Al's work for a very long time now, mostly on LinkedIn. He is prolific in, sort of putting out a vision about what works in EdTech, what doesn't work in EdTech, what's the future look like for educators and these types of things. I don't like anyone's thunder, Al. So why don't you give us the 1 minute? Who are you? Tell us maybe about some of the books you've written, and why do you care so much about this space?
Well, hi, and thank you. It's lovely to be here. How to condense things into a minute? Well, I'm Al. I am absolutely an EdTech fan. I always explain and kind of refer to myself as a man of 2 hats. So half my time is spent as the group CEO of NetSupport, and we're an EdTech vendor and have been making, I think, pretty cool tools for 30 years. And with 30 years under our belt, we're just starting to get the hang of things now. And then the other half of my time, I am the chair of 2 multi-academy trusts. So in US terms, think of them as school districts. I'm also involved with special educational needs, children with alternative provision, and heavily involved in school governance. And I've always been a believer. My children are now in their mid-20s, but when they were little and we were based here in the UK, schools were being built new, and you either shout advice and guidance from the outside, or you roll your sleeves up and you get involved. And I have this lovely position. I count myself being very blessed that spending time in schools, I can see the pinch points and frustrations that staff experience at times, and don't we all in all of our professional jobs. But I have the opportunity to be able to see those ideas, take them away and say, you know what, I think I might be able to come up with a solution for you. And then that feeds into the whole conversation about how do we co-produce, shape the narrative. But there's challenges all around the world with education in terms of vision and long-term planning. And it's something I'm just very passionate about.
Fantastic. And I love you said your children are in their 20s. My children are in primary and almost secondary school now. So I'd love to, I really am interested to jump into your perspective on those topics, because it's something that I struggle with every day, and my wife and I. What do you think? Let's just kick it off with something like that. What do you think is going to change in the classroom now that we're starting to go back to school? Like, what is different now? Now that we've had 18 months of pandemic, we couldn't be more pleased. I literally was talking with my wife last night that, our middle schooler went back to school, after 15 months of being online. It changed person, right? Changed person after 3 months in the classroom, but he's also a super tech head. He loves gaming. He loves all of that stuff. So what do you think? What's ahead for students and teachers?
Let's try and break it into three kind of areas. There's the first sort of more short-term and immediate priorities, I think, and many schools are reacting, depending on where they are on that return to normal, and we can all discuss what normal means now. So the first focus, I believe certainly across our schools, is very much been, let's sort out the social, emotional, and mental health issues first of all. Actually get our children back into the mindset to be happy, first and foremost. Engage with their friends, catching up on some of the things that they miss, whether it's the sports, the drama, the music, the broader kind of richness of school life. And there's no point trying to push kids into that kind of catch-up mindset if they're not actually in the right place to be learning. And we have to remember that sometimes if you haven't been doing things in a certain structured way, it takes a bit of time to get back into the routine of how to learn, how to assimilate and work. So that's one part. Then there's the second part, which is, we're going to have to mention a bit of EdTech along the way in this conversation. So we might as well dive straight in. We've moved. It's been a real paradigm shift. Everyone's been talking about the role of educational technology for, frankly, eons, longer than I've been involved in the space. And people often say, well, it's the same old narrative, isn't it? We should be using more of this stuff. And the answer is no, you've missed the point. The real shift that's changed now is we're now talking about implementing and utilizing technology from a position of evidence. We've actually had to do it. We've tried using it. We can see what worked and we can see what didn't work. Before, many of the narratives were about, we think we'd like to try. We were talking from the theoretical perspective and often saying it's just not top of our priority list. So we were forced to make it a priority, even though we had lots of other priorities suddenly appear at the same time. So I think what it's done is it encouraged and gave teachers and schools an opportunity to take risks. Not significant risks, but risks in terms of try stuff. You've got no choice now. Go out and embrace some technologies. Not all will work, but that's okay. See what we can do to mitigate as best we can and maintain that connectivity with our learners and students. So that's kind of step two. And digital now is much more part of our everyday narrative. And then there's the much bigger one, which is more of the Martin Luther King, I have a dream factor for me anyway, which is, well, I mean, maybe I've oversold it, so I apologize in advance. Yeah, okay. In fact, I have oversold it, so I apologize before I even share it, which is really that focus about that debate between knowledge versus skills. And the more we learn digital, the more we have to recognize that the skills to effectively use technology, to effectively keep ourselves safe, to effectively question and challenge the information that we read and consume all comes together. And we've got this huge pressure away from schools, which is the skills deficit in the workplace for the shifting types of jobs and roles that are happening. And we've got this double challenge in education, which is we can't look and say what jobs are being looked for or being recruited for today, and let's make sure we train our learners to be suitable candidates. We've got to think 5-10 years ahead of what the jobs will be then and start building that into the curriculum and the skills that we develop. So I think, as well as talking digital, both for staff and for students, we've also had a refresh of that. Where's the happy medium when it comes to the skills balance? So lots of different strands.
That is, so much unpack there, which I absolutely love. One thing that I would be really interested, and before I ask you my question, I want to remind everyone, you can just put a question in, if you're watching on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, put a question in the comments there or in the chat down there. We do see them. There's nothing better than to, get a question and be able to respond to it extemporaneously. But if you're also watching the recording of this, throw a question in there. Both either Al or I or one of our team members will be happy to answer you and continue that conversation. So you put those three pillars up there for us to talk about. How does that, we've got a global audience here. How does that change as we go around the world? Are those priorities the same regardless? I mean, I know NetSupport is in, I think it's like 30 countries or something like that. does that change as you see operations around the world, or do those priorities stay the same?
It's a really good question, and I am quite proud. So it's 110 countries we're in now. So,
I missed that one by a factor of 4.
Please don't ask me to list them. Okay, this isn't a quiz or a competition. But on a serious note, the irony is actually it often changes as much within schools within a city as it does around the world. Now, of course, when we think about around the world in education, particularly the lessons of the last 18 months, we're naturally drawn to things like infrastructure and that digital equity, the access to have that option for a different kind of provision away from the bricks and mortars of a school. So clearly some countries had better infrastructure to provide children with access to technology, access to broadband and other connectivity that allowed them to, for want of a better term, level the playing field. And so different countries were on a different timeline in terms of what they could offer. But I actually think when we really look at what are the challenges, let's go down into the city, or frankly, let's go down into the schools within our district, because the real driver is that no two schools are the same. And actually the real shape of where are we at now and what's our next step is firstly shaped by what the infrastructure is within the school, how well resourced it's been or replenished and refreshed over the last, say, 5 years. And also the teaching cohort and the staff cohort in a broader sense. Where are they at in terms of their own digital confidence? And I'm using the word confidence rather than competence, because what our teachers have demonstrated over the last 18 months is, as well as having to become social workers and health workers and all the rest of it, they've managed to acquire and embed an amazing amount of additional digital competence. But everybody's going to be at a different point in that journey. And so I think when we look at these things, you start by saying, well, look, I'm not going to make this a competition. It's not an arms race between our school and the next school as who's got the most tech. It's not about that to say who's got the best solution, because of course the tech is just the facilitator to enable great teachers to do amazing things with young people. It's just, it's part of the show. It's not the main actors on the stage. And so if we think around that, many schools will look and say, well, actually in our school, we probably, in reflection, and I'll include a lot of schools, including some of mine within our own multi-academy trust, we in hindsight probably need to reflect on that hour, 2 hours of training on a new solution at the start of the academic year as inset, and maybe start to think that we should be looking to extend that continuous professional development. We need to be doing the teach meets and the other activities throughout the academic year so that we're building confidence and skills. Many schools have seen an influx of tech that's been supported by government initiatives, but tech isn't the solution. I mean, tech is part of the solution, but we've got to think about the right applications that we put on top of it. We've got to look about the teacher confidence to use those applications effectively so they have impact, and the student confidence. And I was talking quite recently at an event where I had this kind of debate about the old digital natives conversation about, well, young people, they're fantastic with technology, and newsflash. Just because you know how to work technology doesn't mean that you'll be able to work the applications the schools uses, or more importantly, use them safely and effectively. It just means you're bold enough to dive in and you've got a pretty good idea of where to go. So there's that whole wraparound of how do we empower it. And why that's important, sadly, is, if we think about the broader EdTech journey, and I talked about, how it's been different from many years ago. Many of the big tech projects that happened over the years that perhaps were in the press and failed, often it wasn't the technology that failed, it was the implementation. It was that kind of fact that we pushed out all this amazing kit and said to staff on the first day of the new year, teach with that, or that's the new student management system we're using, that's the new curriculum tool. And nobody had confidence using it. And I defy anybody, if you walk into a classroom and you've got 30 eager learners in front of you, and maybe they're particularly enthusiastic, if you don't have confidence that those Chromebooks you take off the shelf and put in front of them when you open the lids are going to fire up and behave the way you expect each time, within a week, you'll start to revert back to, I'll just show you from the interactive screen at the front of class. So within 2 weeks, they'll stay there and you'll be saying, get your books out and we'll look at it in a different way. And so what happens is, without that confidence, those systems never get embedded. And that's why there's a huge opportunity right now for us, because all that new tech, what we don't want to do is in 12 months' time, see it all gathering dust on the shelf.
So the thing that has been simmering in my mind as you've gone through that is the ephemeral nature of mostly software, but also hardware as well, right? I mean, just over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen brand new, tech tools come out in terms of hardware, but literally, I mean, how many billions of dollars were invested into the EdTech universe over the last, 20 months, especially the pandemic? We just saw investment go crazy. I hear one of the great frustrations from educators and instructors, L&D professionals across the entire spectrum is it changes every day. What would you say to that audience about, is it, hey,
Yeah.
pick your favorite tool and run with it, or hey, like the district puts this together, and so like get used to it and feel, and then like just own it, like, because it's
Yeah, I
so
mean,
easy. The shiny object syndrome is such a problem everywhere, right?
it's a double-edged sword in many ways. So on one hand, we're in a fortunate position right now that the edtech space is absolutely growing at a rapid pace, which means we're subject to lots of choice. Well, with lots of choice comes the bigger challenge, which is how do you pick the right one?
Hmm.
And when you pick the right one, you've got to think not just about what do I need today, but you've got to think about the implications of how that might be embedded across your school and integrate with other solutions next year and the year after and the year after. So there's been a very much a shift of late to this change between looking at technology, and implementing it, and sometimes it gets replaced after a short period of time, which is just not a good use of public money. It's not a good use of time or anything else. To much more of a driver for research-informed solutions. In other words, thanks for the brochure. Show me the evidence. Give me the case studies of other schools. If it's pedagogy aligned and it's linked to curriculum and teaching and learning, show me the research that shows that this actually does do what it says on the tin. Give me the reassurance. Then let me trial it. And then once I'm happy that it meets those kind of needs, I need to think about, is it device agnostic? Is it going to work if we decide to change next year and introduce iPads alongside our Chromebooks? Or if we want to start to consider bringing all of our student data through into centralized dashboards to help us track progress more effectively, will it allow us to do that? And then another strand is the opposite, which is it too sticky? And people say, sticky software, Al, you must have, had an extra drink before you came on this evening. But what I mean by that is, do you want a system where once you've got all of your student data in it, it's virtually impossible to get it back out again? Because then you're tied into a system, and you might have the converse challenge, which is you're unable to embrace better opportunities that come along down the line. And that's why you may have heard me mention a few times, I often share a lot of work around digital strategy and about digital vision. And part of that digital strategy process is about that bigger picture before you dive in. And as an edtechy person that is embracing and likes to share about where there can be some really positive impact, the first message I always say to schools, particularly in the last 18 months, is less is more. Get a few core building blocks, do them well, embed them, build staff confidence. If you're successful, you can measure impact. And if you've measured that impact and you've got the confidence they've worked, then everybody within the school is far better placed and more confident to consider taking the next step and investing in something extra. So it's all about really, let's get some small wins. Let's do some things well rather than loads of things on average level.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here about less is more. We've been talking about that a lot over the last couple of years. Before I go down that path, though, I'm interested in talking about the circle of the community that's one step outside of the administration, the teachers, the students, whether whatever level of education you're at, and that's the support people in primary, secondary, whatever. That's parents, but it could be a spouse, it could be some other sort of thing. How do you help, or what is your advice about schools and teachers positioning themselves to have this really, especially in the younger students, this is a critical support unit, especially as we've seen over the last 14, 15 months here, helping them to come along as well, right? And then let me ask it like a sub question as well. Using that evidence to say, hey, no, look, this is going to work out. This is going to be okay, because that has been the big question. It's like, oh, this e-learning stuff just doesn't work. I've heard it a million times.
It's a really good question, and it's really relevant because so many schools have encountered that with their parent and their broader community. I'll take a starter for 10, which is schools kind of went down typically one of two paths, depending whether they were a Microsoft or a Google type platform, and universities maybe already had a broader spectrum of tools that they could use for delivering content and curriculum online. But one of the things that schools did, and we're thinking here perhaps of the younger learners, was that technology that allowed them to engage with the students at home also became, were they conscious and cautious about it, a platform to engage with parents. And we often refer to it as some of our harder to reach parents, the parents that wouldn't necessarily be at the school gate or come in to pick up children, actually engage better when suddenly we had a digital communication in the palm of their mobile phone. So we kind of look at that and say, well, what's the lessons to learn? Well, the first thing is, you're absolutely right. Younger learners, one of the biggest impacts on their progress and development will be how much parental engagement they've got at home to support their teaching and learning. So one of the strands absolutely is, not only do we consider training our students on the technology, but we're also sharing information that explains to parents the tools we're using, why we're using them, and what our expectations are of their child. In parallel to that, and I've always had these kind of, there's a yin and a yang to most of these conversations.
Sure.
If we're enabling our learners with digital technology and we're giving them the tools to communicate and connect online, well, we've also got to put the right tools and skills in place to keep them safe online, to actually inform them so they understand what they're doing. And so with our younger learners, it might start at the very simple, reminder to parents about an open door policy when a child's using technology and is online, to being aware of how they can monitor and control the access to the internet from their home router, or whether it could be some best practice and guidance to teach and develop with their children some digital citizenship, so they understand the implications of their digital footprint. Then there's the transparency layer, and there's lots of layers, unfortunately, but there's the transparency layer, which is, we're using this new solution so we can learn and engage with your child. Well, would you like to tell us what data you're capturing and where you're storing that? And again, in the UK, we have very catchily called DPIAs, data protection impact assessments. But in essence, it's, before you try and implement a solution in a school, you've got to know, what data does that solution capture? Where does it store it? Who has access to it? And how long do you keep it for? And then alongside that, and what would the risk be if any of those were broken? And then a school makes an informed decision about whether it's fundamental, it needs it in order to perform its statutory obligation, which is capture evidence of your teaching and learning, or whether it's really they're asking for way too much information based on what we're trying to achieve with the tool. And that process, if you're being realistic, why wouldn't you share with your parents, these are the tools we use, this is where you can find out about them, and just to be clear, we've checked them for the following. As soon as your child moves to the next year group, their data will be lost, full stop. And I'm simplifying for the benefit of speed. But these things are all interwoven. So we're kind of thinking, well, we need to empower the child to have the right technology. We need to get the parents to support the child so they're safe using it, but also can use it effectively and engage. We can then leverage that platform to engage with our parents. So a really good example in our schools and in many across the country, our parent consultation, parent evenings, where they would normally come in 3 times a year to meet with teachers and discuss their learning, was done online. And that worked much better for working parents. But actually, another big tick in the box for us, given all the pressures, was it was a really big boost for staff, their well-being, because instead of those sessions always going overrunning and being late, and then they had a drive home at 9-10 o'clock in the evening, they could start the session at 6 o'clock in the evening from home, and it was scheduled. And when the 5 or 10 minutes was up, the next one started, and it was managed and it was structured. And so that's a good example where we've seen something that worked well, that whether the pandemic remains or displaces itself, we'll continue to use that moving forward. We'll continue to use it for our special educational needs learners, where that routine and familiarity of a teacher or a teaching assistant or one of the support staff just checking in each day and being that familiar face and routine had a huge benefit in terms of allowing them to cope better with the disruption that we've encountered.
Fantastic. I want to go down the data privacy path in a few seconds here, but I want to circle back to that platform versus sort of extemporaneous versus resource that teachers have out there. So because we are, spoiled for choice, for lack of a better term, in terms of what we are using. I mean, I have 3 children, and I probably have 25 different resources that they use across, their 3 classes, just that I even know about, right? Never mind stuff that's being used in class, like, quick Kahoot things or something like that. What do I do if I'm a teacher and there's something really cool, or there's a resource that just really fits this lesson or whatever, but my district hasn't implemented, or my school hasn't implemented, or I don't have funding for it, or whatever. Like, do you have advice for a teacher about, can they make this work? Should they be entrepreneurial about it? What are your pieces there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of points there. I'll keep the simple starter point is, yes, they should push for innovation because that's what we're all striving to do. But there's ways, and the lesson needs to be learned both from the top down and the bottom up. So one thing we've learned is where schools and districts have made big decisions top down centrally and just passed down the kind of mandate that we're going to be using this new tool from August of this year and everybody needs to use it. That often is a good stepping stone to failure, because actually you've not had the buy-in, you've not had the feedback and the validation from the people who are using it every day, so they don't necessarily understand the purpose and the intent and what the actual choice for that solution is. What's far better is that bring the different stakeholders together, that Venn diagram, teaching and learning, the teachers and students at the heart of it, then your senior leaders that can talk about the strategic plan and the school improvement plan that you might have for your school or district that sits on it, along with your IT manager to make sure the solution you've just decided to implement doesn't mean you've got to spend $1 million on extra Wi-Fi access points and infrastructure to deliver it successfully, as well as your data privacy, your safeguarding, and on the other variables that sit around it. So that's one thing where don't just try and push down mandates, because again, it's not always the most effective way. The second part is one of the reasons why sometimes, not always, to be fair, but sometimes parents encounter, a number of children at the same school and there's plethora of solutions that they need to be familiar with, is because we're still guilty in many faculties within schools of working very much in silos. And so the first thing I always say is, if you've seen a solution that you think would add value in terms of your curriculum delivery, your teaching and learning, or a different way of engaging, who else in other departments across your school or your district is using that solution or using something different? Because there's two wins here. Firstly, the obvious one. If somebody else you find out, or 2 or 3 or 4 are using it, then not only have you got some evidence of impact because you can get their validation that it's worked for them already, you've potentially got some economies of scale if you all think it's the right solution because you're buying on scale. But if we think back to that teacher confidence and CPD, one of the other big success stories was schools creating a signpost, not the phone book of which number to call for each member of staff, but who were the flag bearers? Who are the people that you go to for Kahoot? And who do you go to for Office 365? And who do you go to? And actually signposting the experts gives you a much better chance for staff in the classroom to know who go get support to get the most out of the solutions they've got. Again, if we think that final point I've alluded to about the evidence informed, don't just, throw the toys out the pram and say, hey, I want to use Kahoot and nobody's going to let me do it, so I'm just going to do it. Because then we're into the whole, have you done the right data protection plans and do we know where it's being managed and maintained? But what we can do is we can say, well, actually, before I can try it, I need the evidence from you. Can you give me the case studies? I'm going to find, or give me the references of other schools in our area that are using it that I can speak to, get their feedback so I can present a more complete case up the chain as to the benefits of it. And if we're still not happy, can we go visit? And if we're still not happy, then I'm going to have to recognize I might not be able to do it right now because there's always different priorities in terms of school operation, but I'm going to keep developing my own professional skills. I might do some of the free CPD courses and badges and ambassador things that you can do for different products, so that next term or next academic year, I'm coming and talking from a position of real knowledge and confidence in how that solution works. And I can actually start to share the benefits. One final bit is, what did we learn with our learners with online learning or blended learning or however we want to shape it? We had that synchronous face-to-face narrative, but we also had those asynchronous sessions and the recordings as exemplars. Well, we did it with our students and we gave them those really nice focused 15, 20-minute recordings on different topics to introduce. Well, also schools are realizing that you can do exactly the same for your peers. This is my 15, 20 minutes on Kahoot. These are the benefits. Let me signpost it. And we have one challenge in schools, and I always get told off at this point for being ageist, but given that I'm going quite grey, I can probably get away with it.
Man, it's right there. I can see it.
So one of the challenges sometimes, and again, I'll generalize to avoid too many nasty comments in the feed. The people ultimately making the strategic decisions about most things in a school have a reference point from their own career. They can validate when they're making those decisions and what the strategic impact might be. Technology is moving so fast that often the people who are making those ultimate decisions don't have the luxury of the reference point of how it benefited them in their classroom. in the same way. So the other thing I always have to kind of allude to is EdTech is one of those areas where it comes really down to strength of leadership. And by strength of leadership is having the confidence to delegate. It's the confidence to empower your middle leaders and your other teachers to actually do the lead work and bring back the evidence so that you can support their ambition and their innovation. Because if we always rely on the person top of the tree, we're never going to reach out beyond what their experience or their vision sits around. And of course, their vision may be fantastic in many areas of the school, but tech is so fast moving in many ways. I want to tap into the young teachers that have just joined us from another district. What were you using there? How did it work? How did you innovate? How could we replicate that? And from that point of view, it is that bottom down has that voice.
It's not only the kind of 2 points there. Not only is it being able to reach out and say, look, what do those younger teachers or the new teachers or the people who have just come into tech, ed tech or education from other places, but also and then leveraging them as a really, really massive resource. But also it's recognizing that it's impossible to make a decision about things that you just don't know about, right? So you got to recognize what you don't know, and that goes right to your sort of excellent points on comfort level. I mean, if you have a leadership team that is maybe not prepared for this, what you were describing goes right to my next question. If you're not prepared for this new, then you're immediately going to kind of back off from it because you're comfortable going there. It's just like you're not going to go down that new street because you've always taken this other one home. Going down that new street may not be a great thing. I want to remind everyone, I'm here with Al Kingsley. He's the CEO of NetSupport, EdTech expert, been around for a very long time. We're talking about, the future of EdTech, going back to school. We're talking about data privacy issues. We'd love to get your questions. We'd love to get your comments. Throw them in, regardless of where you're watching, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. And even if you're watching this on a recording, put your question in there. We're happy to answer it afterwards. But Al, what you were just talking about as well was, being comfortable, being, and sort of needing that comfort level in order to really be able to flex the EdTech for what it's for, and as an enabler for delivering education at the end of the day. I'm very interested to hear your opinion on disrupting the mode or, the innovation, actual visions for, putting education out there in a different way. We've had other guests on the show where they said, look, how come so many professors and teachers, they basically just say, we used to go write it on the blackboard, but then we put it on the interactive board, and now we're just going to do that same exact thing here in the interactive world.
Yeah.
Like true disruption. Have you been able to see that in your districts across your things, like where a teacher really kind of rethinks? Like I'm thinking about the name is escaping right now, but a teacher who, she had a game show that she ran, and that was her learning. It completely disrupted it. And have you seen examples of that have been really successful?
I think we've changed the landscape. I mean, I could talk about an infant school. So in UK terms, an infant school is kind of K through 2.
Okay.
Our very youngest learners.
Early years for some of us.
Yeah. So in our infant school, that would be traditional, typical would be lessons sat on the carpet with the whiteboard or the interactive screen learning. We converted an old bus, an old coach, and turned it into a digital classroom where the children can sit with their VR headsets and explore the Amazon rainforest. And they use tablets to hold over a picture of a bug and it comes to life, and they can find out about the bug, and they can explore and see fish in the sea and nature. And part of that is not specifically just about the academic curriculum. It's about stimulating them to want to be enthusiastic, to go away and learn to write about that or share and talk about it, to build their vocabulary and their skills, to develop their interaction, and the sense of the bigger, wider world. Now, some of our schools are in fairly deprived areas, so it's also about exposing them to things they may never have seen before, or language they won't necessarily have heard before at home. But it's also about just thinking about, what do we mean by learning? When we're talking about our very young learners, particularly, sometimes the real value of learning is the fact of when we were in lockdown, they were at home, they weren't following the curriculum, but they were spending quality time with their parents, and they were learning to cook and interact in the house and help in the garden. And in many ways, they're just as important skills in terms of communication, their physical motor skills, developmental skills, and so on. And so I think we have to kind of just widen that kind of perspective of what we're looking at. As we start to move up the age scale, then obviously the STEM subjects have probably, in some regards, been at that kind of forefront in terms of the way that we can look and visualize in learning. I do STEM classes with students in our schools on different times. And, I guess a good example, motorsport, many of our students are really into the F1. So how do you embrace that enthusiasm into talking in STEM subjects? Well, I could, I talk about things like, a race team and how they design their engines, but they don't design them in a workshop. They design them, as an augmented image within a CAD system. So showing them using augmented reality, looking in the room, and suddenly this engine sitting there on the table, and being able to take it apart and understand why that's both cost effective, but also allows rapid development and transfer. And different learners engage in different ways. I mean, you touched on it, gamifying the classroom. In some of our products, we move from we're in a classroom and the students are there and I'm the teacher and I'm going to talk to you. Well, actually, how about I do, quiz questions, quick fire, first to answer, team-based answer, random select, encourage different types of learners where it might be that gamified approach that actually brings them in. I mean, Minecraft. Many parents say, well, Minecraft, it's just a game, isn't it? It's something my kid plays on. Well, when we start thinking about managing resources and space and shape and all the other factors, that actually feeds into lots of strands that we start to develop within the formal curriculum, and whether it's building cities, all that kind of politics, resource management, money, how we deal with things, how things are interconnected. That's learning in a different way, as opposed to a book about the way that inner cities have developed over the 60s and 70s. And I think those kind of things have changed. I think the big one that probably stands out at the moment, we see lots about, and sometimes it's for the right reasons, sometimes there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors, is the adoption of AI and how AI is now shaping some of our learning programs. And in a positive sense, there are some great solutions that are supporting personalized learning. Not to replace teaching and learning, not to replace the teacher front of class, but to supplement, to be that extra layer, particularly out of the classroom, where children can be developed and stretched as they evidence they've got knowledge and they're well cemented in a particular subject. I do get a little bit cautious because I think the AI term sometimes gets thrown into a product, and I'm not necessarily always convinced that the artificial intelligence is anything more than a small list of rules, but that's a whole different topic. But then when we think bigger, not that long ago, we'll think of our university cohort, we would have our pen in our hand and a sheet of paper, and we'd respond to our exams, and we'd evidence our knowledge. And now we use a keyboard and we type it in there and we evidence our knowledge. And when we think about equality and access to all of our learners, and I think about some dear to my own heart in terms of children with disabilities and different needs, I often say, if I can shout for Siri or Alexa to play the next track on my music, why can't I use that as a means of capturing my knowledge and replace the keyboard with a microphone and actually evidence my learning in a different way? And we've only got to start thinking further and further ahead and think, in 20 years from now, will we still expect a child to pick up a pen to evidence their learning and write freehand for 2 hours? Will we do that in the workplace ever? Is that still current and relevant? Or are we actually creating a barrier where we're saying our measure of knowledge will be both on what's in your head and how good your motor skills are? I simplify for effect, but I think all these things shape where there absolutely is a disruption. I mean, the cloud has been disruptive in many ways. It's moved the landscape in terms of what we can and can't do, often in the simple question of what level of technical competence do we need to have on site to manage our infrastructure. It's also changed the pricing dynamic. Technologies often more accessible upfront in terms of cost. I'd argue down the long run, you end up paying more for it, but of course that's the nature of the providers for the hosting online. That's why the model is successful for them. So I think there's been a number of changes, and you kind of look in pockets, and you just have to be big enough to say, sometimes these great innovations that get presented, they're developer and vendor led, and perhaps at the wrong time. So a famous search engine company bringing out some new glasses that allow you to overlay on the screen, presenting those as being a fantastic resource in schools so that a senior leader could see what was going through the headset of a teacher and do their teaching assessments remotely by seeing what they were looking at and saying. I mean, that to me doesn't add value. That adds, an extra weight of anxiety and stress on teachers in a time when they don't need it. But flip it around in different ways and how we can use the technology to level the playing field with different learning styles and different strengths for our students. And hell yeah, I'm in there.
I was reflecting as you were talking. I mean, I can't say the number of times one of my children has come home and said, hey, for our assignment, we're supposed to do a podcast, like a format, right? Where we're going to record an interview with one of our peers, or maybe we're going to go interview an adult about this topic and, turn it in like that. I love the idea of, I personally have been in this debate with several parents over the past, not even just the past over the pandemic, but over the past couple of years, where, hey, where's the, where are the multiplication tables? Where's the, the paragraph handwriting this? And I just going to say, when's the last time you did a long division in your job? So looking at what will the future require in terms of creativity, in terms of leadership, in terms of team development and social skills and those kinds of things.
The thing I have seen, looking all around the world and look at the common factors, is first and foremost, 80% of what goes on in schools goes on for the right reasons. The curriculum doesn't need to be kind of completely thrown in the bin. This is about looking how we adapt to move it forward, And the common glue throughout this, whatever country you go to, and I talk about the technology, but fundamentally the success or failure of teaching and learning is about that relationship and dynamic between the teacher and the students in the classroom. And we can put all the extra emphasis we like on the shiny LED lights and the technology, and it can absolutely facilitate and empower. But we need to remember that if we spent more time focusing on supporting staff, their time, their well-being, their management, and fostering relationships with their learners and giving them the time to do that more, we would probably get the most significant gains of all.
Given that we're talking here about this giant universe of EdTech and adapting to it, becoming comfortable with it, and those kinds of things, do you have one or two go-to pieces of advice about how to give back that time to educators so that they can focus on how do I engage with my learners? How do rather than I'm fumbling with the new tech, or I have to go take that course at night so that I can figure it out. What are your advice?
I mean, there's no one hard and fast solution. I mean, there absolutely is that school leadership need to make more time for professional development throughout the year, not to expect staff to do it in their own time. They need to timetable and factor that in. We need to look and get out of this mindset of the products with the most features are the best. The products that are easiest to use.
It goes to 11 though, Al. It goes to 11. Come on.
The products that are easiest to use, easiest to implement are the ones that are the most effective. It's not a race for who's got the most. So that's another kind of really key one. We've obviously got the focus on don't try and build too many blocks all at once. So actually layer what you're doing in terms of how you actually choose to implement change. Change management, technology just happens to be a word on the end of that sentence. It could be change of anything. We all recognize it's much easier to implement change if everybody feels like they're a stakeholder in the process. Their voice has been heard, their concerns and their aspirations have been put together, and then everyone's going along on a journey with clear expectations of what you want to achieve. If you just try and push it down and drag people along, it's not going to have the right impact and effect. But also, let's just remember that EdTech doesn't stop at the classroom door. And I don't mean in terms of the remote learning, but I mean the rest of the school building. And actually, technology does have a role to play to actually simplify the process for teachers. And the simplification is whether it's in terms of communication, whether it's in the effective use of student academic data and how to provide the signposting and the information so that it's quicker and easier for them to provide, additional support for learners or identify gaps in learning, to better signpost between departments so that we can break down some of those virtual silos and actually share best practice and support and nurture, that we can use tools that allow teachers more flexibility in their working, which is back to well-being. And if we drive any worker in any sector to the point of exhaustion, why would we expect them to perform at their best? Doesn't happen. Many schools decided for economy reasons, some of mine included, I hasten to add, to replace laptops with desktops front of class because they're cheaper and easier to maintain. And then COVID came along and it was like, oh, they haven't got a PC at home. Oh, well, they're bound to have their own device. Well, actually, if we think about respecting people and about confidence, if you have to do your work at home on your own device and then come into school with a USB stick or access your cloud storage onto a different device in a different classroom, I'd argue your confidence level's down a couple of notches on that scale straight away. I wonder if it'll work on this. I wonder who was on here last, what it's going to do. All those kind of little things are simple mitigations by thinking through what are the barriers to success. And the phrase I like to refer to probably too many times, is marginal gains. There's no massive fix. It's not one thing that's going to hallelujah or eureka moment. It is about remove the blockers that will help, and the sum of the parts is what will make the difference.
You've mentioned a lot about accessibility throughout the conversation. Do you have any thoughts on, and you've also said, hey, look, choose the tech it's easy to implement. That's going to probably be the most effective right there. We've had several people on the show before talking about low bandwidth environments. There's still, I hesitate to use the word crisis, but there's still, even in the country I come from, the United States, there's still plenty of places where just even having bandwidth or even having access to a device they can use. What have been the best strategies that you've seen in order to mitigate or overcome or support what is a fairly critical mass of learners?
I think there's a double challenge. So one is that parity of connectivity, which restricts what applications or resources can be done. And then in parallel, we can't forget the fact that for many households, there are multiple children, but only a single device. So actually the ability to have equity in terms of all children in that household having access to a device for the same amount of time is unlikely. So that's why I think we've had that broader conversation about the need to not think that the holy grail of online teaching is synchronous, that actually asynchronous resources that can be accessed when a time suits within a busy family dynamic is really, really important. We can't always come up with every solution being suitable and appropriate for a very low bandwidth environment, because by the nature of many curriculum solutions, they're content rich. What we can do is try and work to, well, what is in our power, and what's in with our power is wherever we can is to look for solutions that are device agnostic. So here's our solution. We hope in the classroom you'll be using it on a Windows laptop or a Chromebook. But don't worry, if you're at home and all you've got access to is an iPhone or an Android phone, you can still access the content. You can still engage within the classes. You can still respond to work and sign and check work in and so on. And it's a compromise, of course it is. But if we look across society, if we start working at the mobile phone in the hand of a child, certainly our older children, as being the common denominator, we exclude a much smaller cohort. And then we also have to remember, and certainly we found very much so over the 18 months, where we tried to mitigate with technology as much as possible. Just because we've got amazing tech and the potential for tech doesn't mean that other ways of learning are no longer valid. Project work, make stuff, write down stuff, access this book, share stuff, all sorts of other bits and pieces, just as relevant. And in many ways, you could argue, it actually adds to that kind of diversity and vibrance of the learning experience by us not suddenly jumping from one side of the fence to too much the other way. In our private lives, yes, I know the mobile phone is rarely far from us, but we like to pick up a book. We like to do other activities that don't involve technology. And I think particularly for younger learners, actually it's more fun making stuff. You can't get messy on a tablet, but you can if you're creating and painting and drawing. So there's always ways that you can compromise. It may not be that you can do what you want at the time you want, and you have to adapt the lesson plans for the next half term to allow for, if we have another lockdown or another disruption. But I think we can find different ways to mitigate. Obviously, I would like to see, and in the UK, it's a narrative at the moment about funding so that school-aged children have access to a funded digital connection to their homes. We're trying to get it so that broadband's available for all children at a certain level, just to make sure there is that parity of connectivity. Whether it'll happen, there's a lot of levers and a lot of money involved in doing these kind of things. So me and many others saying it's a great idea, frankly, probably doesn't carry very much weight. But you've got to have ambition, haven't you? You've got to set an objective. And the other one, which I think is the same whether you're in the UK, the US, or anywhere else in the world, is we've got to stop planning education and education funding based on political cycles. We can't do decisions that require the results and the evidence before the next election, because actually what we need in schools is to plan. And in order to plan, we need to have consistent understanding of where our funding is and what our expectations are on the curriculum for the next 10 years, the duration at least of our learners' journey. And if we can plan, we can probably be more cost effective as well, but we can actually embed and put systems in place, those economies of scale. At the moment, we're constantly changing the expectations, the way that we're measuring our students' progress, or we're constantly changing whether we will or won't. So let's take the last 18 months. We've all got shiny new machines that governments have provided into our schools. And we're told, let's get the most out of them and embed them in our teaching and learning. In 3 or 4 years' time, when they're due for refresh, who's going to pay for the replacement? Are we going to just wait till we end up with 20 between 30 kids, then 10 between 30, and then suddenly the school will say, well, we could never consider buying 500 of these all at once ourselves. We haven't got a plan that allows us to have confidence that these skills we're acquiring and developing now will have the right long-term benefit for our learners. So if you could sort that, Ladek, I'd be really grateful.
Well, I happen to come with my budget. So and my plan for perpetual funding and everything. It's an absolutely great point, and one that I feel like deserves its own hour talk about funding cycles and whatnot. I've got about 15 more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes of Al's time here. I once again just want to remind everybody, Al Kingsley, CEO of NetSupport. If you are still listening to us or you're still paying attention, please do throw a comment in the chat or a question. We're happy to answer it here in the last 10 minutes or so here. I promised, and I wanted to move back to an issue that I think a lot of parents are concerned about, but then even as you move up the chain to adult learners, especially as we're seeing sort of things fall out and fall apart with Facebook right now, data security, data privacy, and who's not only watching my data, who's collecting data, I mean, these kinds of things. Talk to me first about what advice you give to students at all levels about thinking about their data, thinking about privacy, and then we can talk to maybe what parents should be asking their school about and actions they should be taking.
Absolutely. So if we talk about from a student perspective, first of all, and I do put that as one of the wrappers within the digital citizenship narrative. The question is always about, you can frame in different ways with young people. And one of the challenges we have, and it's often discussed from a research perspective, is the challenge of digital disinhibition, which roughly translates to the way that we interact with somebody else online is different to the way that we would do if we were both in the same room.
We've given everybody a couple pints online is what you're trying to say?
Exactly. Exactly. And so that translates not only in terms of how open we might be about things to do with ourselves or photographs we share of ourselves that we perhaps wouldn't do and share if we were stood next to somebody in the same room. We wouldn't hold the photo up in quite the same way and say, look at this and look at that. But it also frames the way that we might engage with you. And that can be a catalyst either in terms of people coming across as aggressive or in terms of bullying without being mindful of how another person might receive that. And so the whole online space creates a challenge in terms of we've first got to teach young people about the right way to interact and respect others. And I know that sounds a little bit black and white, but that's the fundamentals. First of all, it's about respect and considering the feelings of others. And that's something we talk about in schools anyway, but it's putting it in the digital context. The next is that kind of the breadcrumbs. Wherever we go, our digital footprints, we lose control. And it's understanding that once you share a piece of information, whether it's a photograph or a textual piece of information, you lose control. You cannot guarantee, you have to explain to people, oh, it's all right, I deleted it the next morning. And in the meantime, someone could have screenshotted it, copied it, and all the other aspects that could have gone with it. So I think from that point of view, it's understanding the control your information, and if in doubt, don't share. Almost building in that pause buffer. Go away and think about it, and if it still seems like a good idea, then maybe it is. Then there's the third, which is, do you shape and form your opinions online based on what you read, or do you put challenge into what you read? So how do you actually validate an evidence? How might you go away and develop your knowledge on that to find out whether it's true or not, and shape and form your own opinions? So it's not only about teaching children, for want of a better word, to be skeptical until proven otherwise, but actually it's about developing their own individual skills to research. And I think that's really key, because that's a skill that you take throughout your life. The tools to understand how you go away and find extra information and validate and pull that together and challenge the pros and cons of what you hear, I think is really, really important. So those all sit there alongside that. And then, of course, there is that obligation that the school has in terms of providing the right guidance and tools where appropriate within the school setting to actually keep our learners safe. And the learner safe will either be to prevent them going to places and websites or chat rooms where it might place a child at risk, or also to be aware of the fact that if a child is suffering with their mental health or being bullied online, that they feel there are places they can go to report their concerns. And sometimes that's the typical finding a trusted member of staff in the corridor and sharing with them. And sometimes, particularly when it's, often there's, sexual bullying and exploitation, all sorts of challenges that can happen online, it's actually easier to talk one step removed. So actually having a way digitally to connect with a member of staff or simply share. There's a Facebook group that was saying this, that, and the other about me. Again, we want to make sure it's not a one size fits all. And then also signposting for learners where they can go to seek support and advice. And that can be everything from sexual exploitation to radicalization, to the list goes on, which would be approved resources, national providers within the country in question or in the state, or that the school have added as well. That means that learners at different ages can be empowered to seek external guidance and support as well. Sometimes they don't want to go close to home, but we still have an obligation to try and give them the breadth. Put all that together and you say, okay, well, that's us trying to do all the things we can do alongside, school assemblies and class focus on different developmental topics. We need to then encapsulate that in a way that's accessible to our parents. And we want to give our parents the kind of, this is what your children are learning about, but also here are some of the signs for you to watch for. Here are the kinds of conversations be really good for you as a parent to have with your child. Here are the things you could put in place in terms of safeguards to just make sure for our younger learners that they're not left vulnerable or exposed when they're using, their Chromebook or PC when they're online, or even when they've got their headset on and they're in an Xbox or a PlayStation, depending on the type of game. So it might be about advice on age-appropriate games. It might be about these are the things to discuss with your child and make sure they understand. It might be about both for their own physical health as well, about time limits, that the Wi-Fi and internet goes off at a certain time in the evening, or that the smartphone stays outside the bedroom door. Things that will help in terms of sleep cycles and the list goes on. But you have to be proactive and serve that up in different ways, because again, not every parent will engage at the same level and detail. So you try and find different ways of sharing it.
I hope this isn't too much of a curveball, but I'm dying to ask you, do you have an opinion or have you spoken on the role of anonymity in the online universe? And I'm just wondering, from the perspective of so many of the platforms that especially youth engage on, let's just take Facebook as an example, you can be essentially anonymous. You can go into a forum like Reddit, or you can go into a place and, you have a username and this avatar, but it's not really you. And that,
Yeah.
And I'm trying to formulate my question around everything, but because I've always kind of thought, wow, what if we would just get systems where we were verified, right? Where we were verified, which I know is a pipe dream. And I can hear people screaming and cringing as that comes out of my mouth. But do you have thoughts on that, or where that's taking us, or where we're going to go with that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Really appreciate it. I think the problem is there's good arguments both ways. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because in one sense, if we had with some magic wand the ability for all users within a shared space to be validated and verified, we would have more confidence in who we were dealing with. But you have to question whether that would be, assuming it was enforced, well, let's be honest, our confidence levels would diminish at this point already. But even if we could prove that, I think the problem we have at the moment is we don't have confidence in the spaces, in the sense that the spaces, what will they do with our data? How might they use that validated data? So it's definitely Al and Ladek who are signed into a forum. How will that be shared with others? How will that shape my experience in future? And more importantly, if somebody breaches that, will they choose to actually take the right steps to keep our data safe, And I think the problem we've got, I heard recently about a conversation about looking at, a child's equivalent of Instagram, and it just, my immediate is panic really, and fear, because it's we need, at some point, young people need to learn how to interact in adult systems and spaces and so on. But we can teach that within a framework that frankly doesn't need an internet connection if we want them to learn the basic skills of digital communication and so on. But unfortunately, like many things, this just comes down to confidence. It's not the process, it's the operation. And what tends to be proven time and time again is that as things scale and as the user base grows beyond a certain level, the management, the safety net, the support structures tend to never scale at a suitable level and an equivalent pace. And sadly, at some point, the financial levers tend to somewhat dilute the need for the controls that would be, by most parental views, appropriate. I'm sure there are happy mediums out there. I mean, I know, for example, in of one solution that I've done some work with over here. There's a solution called GoBubble, which is referred to as safe social media with stabilizers. Well, in effect, it's purely schools. You can't go anywhere else, and classes can share resources, and you earn rewards for the likes that you give, not the ones that you receive, and you learn the digital skills of how to interact and celebrate and share positivity for others. So you kind of build the foundations of effective use, and that's obviously aimed at younger learners. If I had a magic wand, I'd say you should be 18 to access systems, and they should enforce it strictly. That's my view. Now I'm going to sound really old by saying we should be back out in the garden, climbing trees and playing with things.
But I have to agree. Even as, again, I'm a massive EdTech enthusiast and EdTech enthusiast, and I love the vision of what the future can hold. The possibilities that I see that are being presented for my children they blow me away, and I'm actually fairly envious that I'm probably not going to be able to take part in many of them, mostly because I will want to be sitting on a beach somewhere in retirement. But at the same time, one of the things is I was mentioning to you in the green room before, just the change that we've seen in our eldest child from being purely online to interacting with peers and the socialization and getting messy and making mistakes and bumping elbows and all those things. There's no substitute at the end of the day.
No, and the truth is, it doesn't change as you get older. We can all talk about having these relationships, but I'd say every meeting I have online, where I used to have it in an office, it was the 5 minutes before and after the meeting where you caught up on life and what's happening and how the person really was. And those conversations are the things that really add context to what you do and why you're at work. And so I think we have to remember that that's why very much at the beginning of this conversation, I talked about, the arts, drama, the school performances. In truth, they're the things you remember when you're an adult from your school. You remember the trips to go and see, animals on a farm for the first time, the last production you did of a school play, those kind of things. Of course, you hopefully have fond memories of certain teachers, but actually we want people to go on to the next step of their learning journey with those really fond memories of experiences. And so, yeah, that's why I think it kind of needs to be just brought up a little bit higher on the agenda.
Fantastic. Al Kingsley, CEO of NetSupport. This has been an incredible hour of conversation. I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your evening to speak with me today. I hope that we'll get the chance again in the near future.
I certainly hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning Podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on e-learning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the eLearning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to elearningsuccesssummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about e-learning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.